This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topic tonight, Zelinsky in Canada, where they praised a known Nazi. This is a big scandal in my mind. My guest tonight is a Canadian born and raised attorney. He's of Greek origin. He's a friend of Crimea. He visited Crimea a few months ago. And Dimitri Lascaris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Regis. Good talking to you again.
Oh, yeah, really good to see you. You penned an article on the 28th, 3 days ago now. And being a Canadian, you obviously were embarrassed and a bit angered that the Canadian Parliament, with Zelinsky visiting and begging for more money, gave 2 standing ovations when they recognized a man who is known to be a Nazi. And this has got a lot of people around the world and governments around the world very upset. Tell me, first of all, a little bit about this Nazi. What do you know about him? And the big question is, Dimitri, did anybody know ahead of time who this guy was? I can't believe that they could be ignorant of this.
Yeah. Well, his name is Yaroslav Hunka, and he served in the Galicia division, which was a unit of volunteers formed in Ukraine in 1943 when the Wehrmacht was encountering enormous difficulties in its war of aggression against the Soviet Union. They tried to raise a division and did raise a division. I understand there were some 80,000 volunteers and something in the range of 20,000 were chosen. He was one of them. And he served in the Waffen-SS Galicia division and boasted about it on online. And even went so far as to say, this was 1943 when he entered the division, that the years 1941 to 1943 were the happiest years of his life. And just imagine, Regis, anybody who knows anything about the history of the Second World War would understand that these were absolutely horrific years in Ukraine. The monstrosities, the atrocities, the death, the destruction that was happening. And this man stated publicly that these were the happiest years of his life, one of which was the year in which he volunteered to serve under the Waffen-SS. And somehow, some way, according to the Speaker of Canada's Parliament, the now disgraced Speaker who finally resigned under intense pressure, according to him, he didn't know about this man's past. Now, I have considerable difficulty believing that. I have no proof to contradict what he said, but there's a few things we can say with a high level of confidence. First of all, anybody with even a minimal understanding of the Second World War, the history of the Second World War, would have been, at a bare minimum, deeply disturbed by the way he was introduced. He was introduced as a Ukrainian who fought against the Russians in World War II. Well, what Ukrainians were fighting against the Russians in World War II? And to be fair, most of the vast majority of Ukrainians who fought in World War II fought on the side of the Soviet Union and against the Nazis. But if you were fighting against the Russians, there is a high probability that you were fighting on the side of the Nazis. And despite the fact that he was presented to the Parliament in that way, despite the fact that the Speaker unquestionably knew that he had fought on the side of the Nazis, or he had fought against the Russians in World War II, because that's the way the Speaker introduced him, nobody thought for 1 second in that Parliament that this might mean that this man had been conscripted into or volunteered on the side of the Nazis. No one even purported to care whether that might be the case. I can't believe that that no one in the cabinet, let's just put aside the Speaker for a moment. Let's talk about the cabinet of Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau invited Volodymyr Zelensky to deliver a speech in Parliament in person, something he had not done In fact, I believe this was his first trip to Canada in his capacity as president of Ukraine. And he came to Canada at a time when the attention of much of the world was fixed on his activities in North America, because it was absolutely clear that he was in a desperate condition. His country's in a desperate condition. The counteroffensive had failed, as John Mearsheimer has said colossally. He was involved in a very nasty spat public dispute with Poland, one of the greatest supporters of his regime. The Ukrainian military had suffered just staggering casualties since the counteroffensive was launched on June 4th. And it was clear to the whole world that this trip was extremely important for his government, his military, and the state of Ukraine's ability to continue to conduct this war. So a lot of people were watching. There's no question that Justin Trudeau and his fellow liberals in the cabinet of the Canadian government, who are very, very conscious about their image. This is the one thing about the Liberal Party that we Canadians know all too well. They're extremely concerned about the way they are perceived by the public and very adept at managing their image. We are seriously to believe that at the end of Volodymyr Zelensky's speech, it's an extraordinarily important circumstances where much of the world is watching carefully what's happening in North America, that nobody in the cabinet was consulted. Nobody, not the prime minister, not Chrystia Freeland, not the foreign minister, nobody thought to ask, what does it mean when you say that this man fought against the Russians in World War II? I just find that totally implausible. And the last thing I'll say on this point, Regis, is that what is much more plausible to me is that because Canada has a decades-long history of whitewashing Nazism, and in fact, readily accepted hundreds of individuals who had fought in the Galician Waffen-SS in the aftermath of the Second World War, I think that a lot of people didn't anticipate that there was going to be this kind of reaction. People within the Liberal government, I mean. They knew that he had served. This is again, I can't prove it, but I find this to be more plausible than the explanation we've been given by the government. They knew he had served, and they didn't think people were going to react negatively to this, at least not people that they believe matter. But in fact, mainstream Jewish organizations, when they saw that this was going viral on social media, thanks in large part to a Ukrainian-Canadian professor by the name of Ivan Kachanovsky, that this man had served in this unit of the Waffen-SS. They then, these mainstream Jewish organizations, Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Canadian, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and B'nai B'rith Canada, loudly denounced the ovation for the Nazi. And at that point, the government suddenly realized that this wasn't going to be something that was going to be swept under the rug. They had a full-blown international crisis on their hand, and only then did they denounce this man and apologize for disgracing the country, which is precisely what they did.
All right, a little background. I'm familiar with thousands, I think, of Ukrainians that have migrated to Canada over the years. Hundreds, maybe thousands, came immediately after World War II, and they were known Nazis. Same thing as they came to the United States, Operation Paperclip. Thousands of them came. Werner von Braun was a Nazi in charge of the missile program in Germany, and they appointed him to be the director of NASA. And they placed these people in strategic positions in government. I'm sure they did the same thing in Canada. But in Canada, there are monuments to known Nazis in cemeteries. There are clubs. They even have, I understand, they even have a movement for young people to indoctrinate them in this nationalistic ideological background of which we see now in Western Ukraine. Tell me a little bit more about how influential, because I think this is important, and I think this may be why so many people in Parliament or even in the cabinet have just been influenced by these Ukrainian blocs, these Ukrainian lobbyists. I mean, they're very powerful from what I understand. I find it, as you said, implausible. I find it impossible for them not to have had a clue about who this guy was, but a little bit now on the history of Ukrainians in Canada and how powerful they've become.
Well, my understanding of the evolution of the Ukrainian community, the first Ukrainians who came to this country tended to be quite progressive in their outlook, particularly those who came before the Second World War. But when the Second World War ended, the Western powers, and Canada being effectively beholden to the most powerful states in the West at the time, Great Britain and the United States, its government was ideologically more hostile. This is just the reality, and history proves it. More hostile to socialism and communism than it was to Nazism, and it thought that these Nazis, because that's what in substance they were, would effectively constitute a bulwark against the spread of socialism and communism in Canada, and that they might be useful outside of the borders of the country in the event of some kind of conflict with the communist world. And so they brought them in, knowing full well that they had served in the Waffen-SS and intending, at an appropriate time, in their view, to use them in order to, combat the spread of communism and socialism. And since then, there have been, as you pointed out, there have been monuments erected to people who served in this division of the Waffen-SS. There are, people in this country that openly celebrate, people of Ukrainian origin who openly celebrate the odious legacy of the murderous Stepan Bandera. Our own deputy prime minister, it's absolutely appalling. I can't even believe some days I wake up that this is true. But our own deputy prime minister lied about the fact that her grandfather, I'm talking here about Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather, whose last name was Chomiak, had been the editor of a Nazi newspaper. And when she was caught lying with the help of some Russian diplomats in Canada, rather than being held to account for lying and presenting her grandfather to the Canadian public as a champion of democracy, the Canadian government expelled the Russian diplomats who revealed this appalling truth to the Canadian public. And then subsequently, Justin Trudeau elevated Chrystia Freeland. At the time that she did that, she lied about her grandfather. She was the foreign minister. He then elevated her to the position of deputy prime minister and finance minister. She then, after the special military operation commenced in February last year, she went to a pro-Ukrainian protest in Toronto and put on the scarf of the murderous organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the OUN. And when she got called out, she actually posted a photograph of herself wearing their scarf. When she got called out for it on social media, she deleted the photograph and then replaced it with another photograph with her wearing a different emblem of the Ukrainian, the pro-Ukrainian groups. And so this is perfectly consistent. What happened in Parliament is perfectly consistent with the way the Canadian government has behaved for decades. That's why it's one of the reasons why nobody should believe the malarkey we are being told about how this happened. There's no reason to think, given decades of whitewashing of Nazism in this country, that anybody in the hierarchy of the Liberal Party was troubled by the fact that this man served in the Waffen-SS. What happened, as I say, is they got called out for it by mainstream Jewish organizations, and they were left with no alternative but to admit that what they had done was absolutely disgraceful. And the other thing I want to say is there was a, and this is mentioned in my article, there was a commission struck I think 30, 40 years ago. It's called the Deschênes Commission, which was called upon to look into the history, what extent Canada was harboring people who had collaborated with the Nazis from Eastern Europe, in particular Ukraine. And this organization, this commission, which was headed by a judge by the name of Deschênes, and that's why it's called the Deschênes Commission, amazingly came to the conclusion that no action should be taken against these people. And apparently his reasoning was there was no specific direct evidence of any of these people having actually participated themselves in atrocities. What he appears to have completely ignored was that the Nuremberg Tribunal declared the Waffen-SS to be a criminal organization. So I would say as a lawyer that you have a perfectly plausible basis to prosecute these people under international law purely, and domestic Canadian law, purely on the basis that they were members of a division that served under the Waffen-SS. That was completely disregarded by the Deschen Commission. And so, this was not an accident, Regis. This was inevitable. Somewhere, somehow, something was going to happen that was going to reveal the ugly face of Canada's whitewashing of Nazism.
Yeah, you mentioned the apology was late in coming. I think a couple of days went by until so much international pressure built up that Trudeau was forced to apologize. You didn't think it was very honest? Tell me about that.
Well, in his apology, first of all, he rhymed off a litany of groups that had been victimized, brutalized by the Nazis, but he left one out, and that group was the people of Russia. He had absolutely nothing to say about the gargantuan sacrifice that the Russian people made in defeating Nazism. The Soviet Union and it lost some 27 million people in the defeat of Nazism in the Second World War. This was far more than all of the casualties, military and civilian casualties of the United States, Canada, France, Britain, and even Germany itself put together. And of course, the majority of those, by no means all of them, and a significant number of them were in fact Ukrainian, these Soviets who died. But the majority of them, the very large proportion of them, were Russians. And Trudeau said nothing about this, said absolutely nothing. Now you can say, you want to say you condemn the Russia's military intervention in Ukraine in 2022, go ahead and say that. But that's not a reason, even if you take that position, that it's not justified, that it's a violation of international law. It is not even remotely a reason for us to disregard the gigantic sacrifice that the Russian people made in the defeat of Nazism, far greater than the sacrifice that was made by any Western country. And he should have understood that honoring this Nazi in Parliament with not one but two standing ovations was deeply offensive to the Russian people, so many of whom lost a family member or more than one family member in the Second World War. And it was outrageous that he didn't mention them at all in the groups of people who were victimized by the Nazis. And he even went so far in comments to the press when he finally decided he had to sound apologetic about all of this. He went so far as to somehow try to connect what happened in Parliament with Russian disinformation. Well, I'm absolutely confident that the Russian government had nothing to do with Yaroslav Hunka being invited into Canada's Parliament and presented as a hero and eliciting two standing ovations. So, it's just ridiculous that in the West, whenever, there's a failure, an embarrassment, a mistake, or an outright, atrocity on the part of a Western government, they somehow always find a way to blame the Russian government. I mean, we're tired of this shtick. We've heard this shtick before. It doesn't work anymore. Most of us now understand that what's going on is they're looking for a convenient scapegoat for their own moral depravity.
Wow, well stated. I want to get back to Chrystia Freeland. You documented pretty well her history and her grandfather, the lies that she told. But she actually spent time in Ukraine, and she's a well-known Russian hater, as most people are in Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine, by the way. Dimitri, she had to know this Yaroslav Hunka. Is that his name? Hunka.
Yes, Hunka. Yeah.
Well, could she not have known? I mean, really?
Is it theoretically possible? Yeah, sure, anything's possible. Is it likely? No. I mean, come on, let's be serious. Her grandfather, this newspaper that her grandfather edited, this Nazi newspaper, actually had, as I understand it, based on some recent reporting, was advertising for people to enlist in the Galicia division of the Waffen-SS. And I also understand, again, due to some recent intrepid reporting by independent media outlets, that her great uncle, I believe, actually served in this unit himself. So a member of her family served in the unit. The idea that Canada's ex-speaker, Anthony Rota, knowing the intense preoccupation of the deputy prime minister, the second most powerful person in the Canadian government, has with Ukraine, and also, by the way, Chrystia Freeland has held herself out for years as an expert on Ukrainian history and culture. The idea that Anthony Rota didn't consult the deputy prime minister's office, that he didn't tell her that this man was going to be honored in Parliament when Volodymyr Zelinsky was delivering a speech, and that no one in her office cared to inquire about this individual's background and why he was going to be presented to the Canadian public as a Ukrainian hero. I mean, this is just, you have to live in La La Land to believe this story. Again, I can't prove it, but it just flies in that she knew. But it flies in the face of common sense and everything we know about Chrystia Freeland and how the Liberal government operates, that she would have had no inkling about this, and that the first time she learned purportedly that he had served in the Waffen-SS was when mainstream Jewish groups began to denounce this in the public domain.
You also mentioned in your article, you mentioned Trudeau just overlooking that so many Russians died at the hands of the Nazis. You basically said he's guilty of whitewashing Nazism. But hasn't the West, and with America leading, UK following, Canada right on its heels, been whitewashing all of the history of World War II? I mean, they've whitewashed Russia right out of it, or Soviet Union, today's Russia. Tell me a little bit more about this whitewashing that's going on and has been going on in Canada, but really now is going on all over the West.
Well, I'll tell you, I was born in 1963 in southwestern Ontario. And I was raised in the public school system in Canada in the 1960s and the 1970s. I attended undergraduate studies university in Canada. I attended law school in Canada. And I can tell you, a lot of what I learned in the course of my education, both in the pre-university level and university, was, related to Canadian history in one way or another, and geopolitics, and the Second World War. No one ever told me. I was never taught by any educator in the Canadian educational system that the Russians had lost far more, that the Soviets had lost far more people to the Second World War than all of the Western Allies combined. No one ever told me that fact. I found that out on my own later in life when I graduated from law school, just by doing personal research and investigating the matter myself. And I was astonished to find out that this was the case. So I can tell you on my own personal experience that the educational system in Canada, if it hasn't completely disregarded the sacrifice of the Russian people, it certainly has downplayed it. It certainly did in the decades when I was growing up and studying in Canada. And I think it continues to do that to this very day. I mean, they talk about the Second World War as though the defeat of Nazism was entirely an achievement of the United States, Britain, and their Western European allies in Canada. That's the way they talk about the war, even to this very day. There hasn't been any attempt whatsoever to honor the sacrifice of the Russian people. The idea that this complete contempt and indifference for the sacrifice of the Russian people is, reflected in our policies towards the Ukraine war, where you have German main battle tanks, dozens of kilometers from the Russian border, trying to kill Russian soldiers. I mean, if we had any inkling, any feelings whatsoever, any regard for the sensitivities of the Russian people, for what the trauma of the Second World War, we never would have allowed that to happen. We never would have allowed ourselves to become embroiled, particularly Germany, in this heinous proxy war in Ukraine. So, in every conceivable way that I can think of, Regis, this country, the people in this country have been inculcated, have been indoctrinated to think that, we're getting to the point because so few people today, so few people who are alive today actually experienced the Second World War. We're getting to the point where it's rather easy to manipulate the history of the Second World War. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are a lot of people in this country who actually think that the Soviets fought on the side of the Nazis in the Second World War. That's how distorted our view about this extraordinarily important chapter in modern history has become.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. It's been the same thing for my education in the United States. I'm a little bit older than you, but I am post-war World War II baby boomer, and everything was a glorification of what America did. And the odious thing about it is, for the last few years, they've not even invited Putin to celebrations of the Normandy landing. They've not invited him. And we're talking about whitewashing history now. This attempt is really heinous. Vladimir Putin here in Russia has made a point politically, publicly, internationally, accusing the United States and the West of whitewashing history of World War II. And even in the country, an enormous effort is being made in the Russian educational system to make sure that the truth and the facts are taught to children and university people. Now, I want to get back to something else that I really think is part of this whitewashing. It happened at the United Nations. United States, Canada, and I don't know who else voted against a UN resolution condemning Nazism. Geez, I can't freaking believe that. I mean, you talk about getting angry. Was that where part of your anger came from too?
Yes, thanks for reminding me about that. It's something I talk about in my article. I believe they voted against, the Trudeau government voted against this resolution not once, but at least twice. And of course it passed. It passed with the support of the vast majority of states representing the vast majority of the human population. And the countries that voted against it or abstained were almost entirely from North America and Western Europe. What can one say about the moral depravity of a government or a set of governments that not only failed to vote in favor, they didn't vote in favor, they voted against a resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. And Trudeau, as I mentioned, he elevated his Chrystia Freeland, his foreign minister, to the position of deputy prime minister after she lied about her grandfather's Nazi activities. He imposed no penalty on her when she wore in public the scarf of the murderous organization of Ukrainian nationalists. Our government, our military, I should say, was revealed by mainstream Canadian press shortly before the war began in Ukraine to have trained members of the Azov battalion. They were boasting about this online, these neo-Nazis, that they had received training from the Canadian military. There was no penalty imposed upon anybody for that, as far as we know. And in fact, after that, the Canadian government, the Trudeau government, started pumping billions of dollars of weapon into Ukraine with virtually no oversight. So this man, as I say in my article, Justin Trudeau, is as guilty as any Canadian prime minister of whitewashing Nazism. In fact, he arguably is the worst, given where we now stand.
You mentioned something very important, and a lot of people in the West will absolutely cannot believe that there are Nazi battalions fighting in Ukraine. These Nazis, they're followers of Bandera, and I think there's probably millions of people in Western Ukraine, if there's any left, who support Bandera. Zelinsky made a national holiday out of this guy. They're erecting monuments to him. They have parades with his picture several times a year in Kiev. Zelinsky himself, he's beholden to these, and there's not just one. The Azov is the most well-known. He's beholden to these guys. It's been reported they told him at the very beginning, if he ever pleaded for peace, they would kill him. And you and I both know that not only have there been Canadians in Ukraine training Nazis, training regular Ukrainian troops, there's been American special forces. I know that for a fact. There have been special forces from the United Kingdom, supposedly training them in Great Britain, but they've been in there. And it's been documented, whitewashed really, that there have probably been many dozens of these foreign nationals who have been killed in Ukraine by Russian forces, missile attacks. And what are they doing? You know what? Oh, we're supposedly advising them. We're giving them satellite intel, real-time intel. We're giving them coordinates. And you know what? These missiles that they've been firing lately and these drones that have been being shot, the Ukrainians do not have the skill. They've not been trained in using that technology. And so Russia now is beginning to say, we're really involved in a war against the West, against NATO.
Mm-hmm.
I have refused, Dimitri, almost since the beginning, to use the term proxy war. I mean, to me, this is not a proxy war. When you have America spending $175 billion there since before 2014, your government spending billions, all the weapons from so many countries, some 30 different countries, you're telling me this is a proxy war? This is a war of the United States using its vassals against Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Biden has said it. The generals have said it. Our goal is to get rid of Putin and to take down Russia. Now, how can anybody say that that's a proxy war? I'd like your thoughts on that, Dimitri.
Well, I've said many times, Regis, and I'll continue to say until I'm blue in the face. NATO is at war against Russia. There's no definition, no sensible, rational definition of war that leads to any other conclusion. You mentioned all of these various factors: the real-time battlefield intelligence, the value of the weaponry that has been given by NATO to Ukraine, on paper at least, is worth approximately as much as the annual military budget of the Russian Federation in the year preceding the military intervention in February of last year. There was a very interesting episode, which I recommend people find on social media. It's not hard to find, where two Russian pranksters somehow got the phone number or found a way to contact Sarah Ashton Cirillo, who is the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces, an American citizen. And they one of them posed as Petro Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, and began to pepper Ashton Cirillo with questions about what was happening on the battleground. She didn't know that that this was going to be shown to the public. And what she said was that many of the fighters from outside of Ukraine, people who come from the West to fight for Ukraine, lean to the far right. That's what she said. So we're not only sending, or at least tacitly approving, thousands upon thousands of citizens from NATO countries, many of whom have been trained in NATO militaries, to go and fight shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian military, with Ukrainian citizens who have taken up arms. But a lot of these people, according to Sarah Ashton Cirillo, the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces, are far right. That's who we're sending a lot of these people to fight alongside Ukrainians. And furthermore, there's the economic warfare. We in the West imposed a set of sanctions which were as draconian as any we have imposed upon any state in recent history, if not ever. And the obvious intention of those sanctions was to destroy the Russian economy, and which unquestionably would have caused immense suffering to millions upon millions of Russians, whether or not they supported the government of Vladimir Putin. So in what respect is NATO not waging war against Russia? Just because we haven't thrown our active military forces, infantry, into the battle en masse, again, by any rational definition of war, we are at war with Russia, and we're escalating it and the Russians understand perfectly well that that's what this is. I don't think they have any illusions about this at all. And frankly, I'm absolutely amazed that the Russian Federation has refrained from attacking any of the NATO states that are escalating this war, in particular Poland and the Baltic states. I think that the Russian Federation, in terms of retaliating against NATO, whatever you may think of the way it's conducting the war on Ukrainian soil, when it comes to retaliation against NATO for NATO's open belligerence and acts of war against Russia, including, by the way, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which almost certainly was a crime committed by the Biden administration, it has shown extraordinary restraint. And I don't think we in the West can continue to assume, we should not continue to assume that that restraint is inexhaustible.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And that restraint has kept us all alive. Because had Russia taken the bait and responded, it would have led to nuclear war. And no one is going to survive that nuclear war. I want to ask you this, Dimitri. The people of Canada, have you read any reports on how they've responded to this? Or was it just like in America, oh, ho-hum, no big deal. Just we feel powerless. We can't do anything about it. But has there been any public blowback because of this?
Well, Justin Trudeau is, the last poll I saw, Justin Trudeau is now, his government, or he personally, is 12 points behind his main challenger, a conservative by the name of Pierre Poilievre. Poilievre is spectacularly unqualified for the job of Prime Minister of Canada. He's every bit as supportive of Western policy towards this depraved war and NATO, and he's a dyed-in-the-wool neocon. He's not by any means a formidable opponent for Justin Trudeau to have to confront, and he's 12 points behind. And I think that certainly has something to do with the disgraceful events of last week. And I think we're going to see that margin widen even more in the days ahead as it sinks in the Canadian conscience just how disgraced our country is now internationally. But also, there was a poll a few months ago which showed that the number escapes me. I believe it was somewhere in the range of 32% of Canadians did not support elevating military aid, escalating military aid to Ukraine. And I believe it was less than 50% did. And this is in a media environment in Canada. I mean, the media here, the mainstream media in Canada, is as pro-war, pro-Ukraine, and Russophobic as any media in any Western country. And to see that percentage of Canadians saying, we don't want to be sending more weapons to Ukraine, despite the level of propaganda around this war, I think is a pretty powerful statement. And that was a few months ago. I suspect now, this was before the colossally disastrous offensive that Ukraine has been conducting since June 4th. Now, with all of these events, I will be very interested to see what the polling shows in the days and weeks ahead, given what has happened on the battlefield and given what happened in Canada's Parliament. I suspect that support for this war amongst Canadians will plummet and has already plummeted.
I think we're seeing this in the United States as well, south of the border. Just what happened in Congress. Mostly Republicans, some Democrats said, no, we're not going to approve this spending bill unless you reduce the $25 billion to something, I don't know what it was. I can't remember. Maybe a couple of billion. But it was a compromise, but it really showed that the narrative is changing. And I do think the American people are tiring of this. More and more people are beginning to understand, I think, that taking care of Americans and taking care of America, taking care of the immigration problem that we have is more important, and joblessness and homelessness is more important than sending money to some country that most of them can't find on a map. And Dimitri, as we look across what's happening in the EU, there's massive protests happening everywhere. Czechoslovakia, even in Poland, people are rising up. In Germany, people are rising up. In Italy, it's happening all over. The people are beginning to feel they are not being represented by their governments. Now, that brings me to the conclusion of your article. You demanded Justin Trudeau resign, and you demanded that his last act as prime minister was to get rid of Chrystia Freeland. You think that's even possible?
Well, I don't think what I think is within the realm of possibility. And just to be clear, why I said that, it's not just because he's as guilty as any prime minister in Canadian history of whitewashing Nazism. That is true. It's not just because he offended the Russian people. And as I say, no matter what you think about the war in Ukraine, their sacrifice and the sacrifice of their ancestors deserves our deepest respect. And he should have personally apologized to the Russian people for honoring this man in Russia's parliament. It's not just that. It is even more so the fact that Justin Trudeau is so deeply invested in this war that there is absolutely no prospect of his government doing an about-face and approaching this conflict in a humane and rational manner by advocating for diplomacy and negotiations to bring it to an end. There's just no prospect of that happening. And I think if you needed proof of it, you should watch a speech, which I reference in my article. I hyperlink to a video of it. It was a rally that was held in Toronto. I think it was the night before the disaster in Canada's Parliament. Trudeau was speaking, and he was about to introduce Zelinsky to this crowd, and he literally descended, Regis, into a frenzy, a pro-war frenzy. I've never seen him behave this way. I didn't even see George W. Bush behave this way at the height of the War on Terror. He was bellowing at the top of his lungs that Ukraine must win this war, when all evidence leads to one conclusion, that there is no prospect of Ukraine winning this war. There are two ways this war will end. If it continues, it will end in the destruction of Ukraine, or it will end in a nuclear war and in the destruction of us all. This is the only two realistic possibilities at this stage if the war continues. So he's lost touch with reality. And the only way we as a country are going to come to grips with, diplomacy, a negotiated resolution of this existentially dangerous war is to remove this man from power. It's the only way. And this is true of Biden. This is true of Macron. This is true of Olaf Scholz. This is true of Rishi Sunak in Britain. These people are all so politically invested in this war that there's no off-ramp that they're prepared to pursue. It would be too disgraceful. So he has to go by any and all lawful means necessary. They all have to go. What do I think is realistically possible? Do I think that Trudeau is going to come forward? Because, I don't believe he's going to come forward and say, you know what, I've behaved in such a disgraceful manner, and my policy with respect to the war in Ukraine is so flawed, so dangerous, so inhumane that I've decided I have to go. What would happen is that people within the Liberal Party, and I think there's some of this probably going on right now as we speak, they're having conversations with Trudeau, powerful and influential people in the Liberal Party, and are saying to Trudeau, or suggesting to him in as polite a manner as they can, that maybe he shouldn't run in the next Canadian election, which is scheduled to take place in 2025, and that whoever replaces him is going to need time to settle into the job and establish themselves with the Canadian public. And so he would need to step aside as Prime Minister and leader of the party well before the election in 2025. I think that there's a realistic prospect of that happening. And the thing is, though, Canada, let's just be honest, Canada's a vassal of the United States government. So even if that does happen, it's not going to change the course of the war. We need this to happen in much more powerful countries, and particularly the United States. We need peaceful democratic regime change in the West. That's how we're going to bring an end to this war.
You answered the question I was just about ready to ask you. How do you think it's all going to end? And I think the media in the West, the United States and Canada, have just been lying about what's going on in this war. Ukraine has nothing left, really nothing left. these missiles and drones that they're firing at us in Crimea almost every day. And so the war is beginning to hit home in Crimea. People are not frantic. They're not terrorized. They're not worried. They're going about life as they always have. But as I mentioned before, the Ukrainian military are not the ones firing these missiles and guiding these missiles. They're not the ones flying in the airplanes off Bulgaria or Romania, giving satellite coordinates so these things can avoid, being detected. And I think, Dimitri, what you talked about Russian restraint in the West, that's being interpreted as weakness. That Putin is weak, Russia is weak. Look, see that? He doesn't even retaliate. I wish these people could realize that they'd all be dead right now, because as you mentioned, it's only going to end, if it continues, two ways: the complete destruction, not only of Ukraine, NATO, and the loss of credibility for the United States as well, or a nuclear Armageddon. It's really frightening, and I don't think people really understand and realize what a dangerous time we're living in. Dimitri, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to see you again.
And by the way, Regis, please stay safe in Yalta. I follow the news carefully about the attack, the whole war, but also the attacks on Crimea, and stay safe out there, man.
I have to laugh. Everybody, I get so many emails. Please be safe. Stay safe over there. And I have to tell them, I don't care if you're in Topeka, Kansas, or you're in Bangor, Maine. You are no more safe than I am in Crimea when you really think about what could happen.